please turn to chapter 24. It's on page 283. Great Heart and the Hill of Difficulty. We just finished with the interpreter, and Christiana, Mercy, and her 4 sons are all there, and with Great Heart coming up now to the Hill of Difficulty, and they're going to make their way to the top. And in the chapter, Great Heart has a discussion with them about the pardon done, the deed by which their pardon came at the gate. And they're going to learn some about how that deed is the deed by which they were pardoned. And then as they travel along, they're going to come across the place where simple sloth and presumption had lay and slept when Christian had met them on his pilgrimage. But now they're hanged up in irons. And they were, there were people who followed after them. People like Slow Pace and Short Wind and No Heart and Linger After Lust. And these people came to the same end. And lessons were taught there about them. And then they begin at the foot of the hill of difficulty going up, and there's a discussion about formality and hypocrisy and how they lost themselves by not going up the hill of difficulty, even though there was now barriers put up about the way formality went around the hill and hypocrisy went around the hill, and they put up these barriers after Christian came through there to keep people from going down the same path, but yet there were people on the path that Great Heart tells them will still go around the barriers and not go up the hill of difficulty. Then they began to climb the hill, and the children, everybody gets tired, but the children, one of the children actually needs help, and Great Heart takes them by the hand and encourages them and says there's an arbor to come, and they get to the arbor and they're all refreshed. And then after resting, they ascend even further. But Christiana left one of her belongings behind and sent her son to go retrieve it. And there was a discussion about how Christian also forgot. Christian lost his book, and Christiana left her bottle there. And there was a discussion about it being like a place of losing, yet it was the prince's arbor. And from there, they go up to where he ran into Fearful and Mistrust. And there was this platform on which both Fearful and Mistrust were burnt through the tongue with a hot iron. And Mercy said, "This is similar to the saying of the beloved, what will he do to you, and what more besides, O deceitful tongue? He will punish you with a warrior's sharp arrows and with burning coals of the broom tree." This is a lesson learned from the where Mistrust and Fearful wound up. And then they go on and they come across the lions of Christian, but the lions aren't alone this time. Who's with the lions? Yeah, Mr. Grimm. And the grass has grown up, so there's not, that path hasn't been trod very much with Mr. Grimm there, and he makes it very clear he's not going to let them pass through. And then the children move back into the back. They're no longer wanting to lead. And Great Heart goes forth to fight Grimm, Mr. Grimm, and slays him. And they make it through. Did I miss anything on the story? Okay. So, a lot of truths represented. Some of them aren't easy, I think, to interpret. The pardon done by The pardon by the deed done was what? What is that representative of? That one's an easy one. The work of Christ, right. And specifically at the bottom of page 283, he talks about it in a twofold way. What's the twofold way of the work of Christ? Without looking at your book, does anybody know that? Yes, that's right. Active and passive obedience. Well, the question is going to get into that when we get there. So there's a lot of discussion about the righteousness of Christ, and particularly that imputed righteousness that we receive in salvation. The lesson by simple sloth and presumption, those are just people who aren't converted and they're on the King's highway, and since they're given to simplicity, slothfulness, and presumption, all those that follow in similar footsteps are people who are like this. They have no heart. They linger after lust, and they're sleepyhead, and they're dull. And they're dull in the sense spiritually. And they come to the same demise. And they have no taste for the things of God. They call the bread of God husks. So that's representative of people that doesn't value the things of God, and they're in the King's highway professing, but since they're still in bondage to their sin, they come to ruin. They come to their end, death. Then they come up to the hill of difficulty. And at first there was a spring by which Christian had drunk, but it was murky. I forgot to mention that. But then Greatheart tells them just let it sit, and the dirt will go to the bottom, and the water's still clean. The formality and hypocrisy is ways of, remember that's also false professing Christians. One is given to hypocrisy. They know they're living in sin and they're putting on a show, and they do not want to suffer and deny themselves in going up the hill of difficulty. They don't want to face the world as a righteous believer. They want to face it with their sin. And so they won't go up the hard way. They won't go up the King's highway. They'll try to go around another way. And the hypocrite does so knowing he's in sin, but puts on a show. And formalist is more sincere about his error. He's trying, but not the same as the hypocrite. And they have two different ways they try to go around God's only path. And then blocking it off is just to warn. It's like a warning. Don't go be a hypocrite. Don't be a formalist. And the fact that people still go around, the proverb is taught, and it's hard for a lazy man, or what was the proverb? Thorns. Let's see where that is real quick. Two were cast, chains and posts, 290. Says, if you look a little further, you'll see that these ways are made ominous enough, not only by these posts, ditch, and chain, but also by being bordered by thorn hedges. Yet they'll choose to go there. The uphill way is unpleasant to them, so it is fulfilled to them as it is written, the way of the sluggard is blocked with thorns. So that's talking about spiritually talking about righteousness. To the person in bondage to their sin, alienated from God, and an enemy of God, the idea of serving God and trusting God and obeying Him, even when it's difficult, is worse to them than what they think is an easier way. But that easier way actually is harder because it's a way of sin. And the sluggard text is talking about someone that won't live for God. They won't live in the fear of God. They won't live in biblical wisdom. And actually, they think that they're relieving themselves of certain suffering. But all they get for themselves is more suffering, worse suffering. If not in this life, of course in this life to some extent, but certainly in the next. And you could see that like in Romans 3, it says their path is, let me read that. It says, destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace they have not known. So the unbeliever that refuses to trust God and follow Christ thinks that they're actually taking an easier route in life, but their life is one of destruction and misery and without peace. The arbor is representative of God refreshing his people in the midst of suffering, in the midst of trial, in the midst of temptation, and spiritual experience of those blessings that they already have. And the lesson of losing there is related to when Christians do receive relief from temporal forms of suffering and temptation, they often don't remain watchful in the midst of their abundance and end up sinning, not in the flesh, in response to a blessing. So that's why it's called a place of losing. Going on from there, I'm just going to go up to the last person, Grimm, and make a comment about him. So I want to ask y'all that when we get here, so maybe I'll skip some middle ones to get to this at the end, but I'd like to hear who you think Grimm is. Remember that we discussed, we weren't sure who the lions represented. I think, Nikki, you mentioned back when we were looking at the lions way back when, that represented the church and the state opposing people coming to the local church. And I think that's what Bunyan intended because of the persecution that was going on at that time and the place that the lions were placed at in relation to Palace Beautiful. So Grimm is there with the lions. So it's like, who is Grimm? Any questions there before we jump into the questions? I kind of just stated that out front so you have an idea where we're headed. Now we've got we did a little like flyby, and now we're going to land the plane and we'll start walking through the same territory. Okay, so question 1. What does it mean to have pardon by deed? What is pardon? What's another word for pardon? Forgiveness, right. Forgiveness, God takes up our sin and lifts it away and separates it from us. And it's done by deed. Whose deed? Is it a corporate deed or one person's deed? I heard Christ, that's right. Amen, Christ. And we talked about it being doubly, or a double way, a twofold manner. And it was active and passive. Now, when please think about this. What does that mean, active and passive obedience? We're talking about the work of your Messiah, the Christ of God. And many people only understand the gospel in a passive obedience of Christ merely. When you ask them, even a Christian, brothers and sisters, tell me the gospel. What I will often hear as a focus is just the passive. What is the active? If everybody's talking about the passive, what is the active, right? So I wanted to share a little bit with you. And the reason why this is important, just I think I don't need to say it, but just to remind you, we're talking about that work of Christ by which you're justified. We're talking about that work of Christ through which you are able to observe the glory of God. The more you understand what Christ has done, not merely his person, but his person by his works, when you see what God has done through Christ, you better understand your Maker and your Redeemer. And it informs your worship, it informs your evangelism and your prayers. So this is not pedantic. Christ's obedient work as mediator performed for our redemption is distinguished by active obedience and passive obedience. And I'm reading from Dictionary of Latin and Greek Theological Terms by this guy named Richard Muller. The active obedience describes the life of Christ. This is the active obedience. Describes the life of Christ from his birth to his death, particularly his ministry, during which Christ acted sinlessly and in perfect obedience to the will of God. So Jesus Christ acts from birth to death in perfect obedience to the will of God, and that active obedience is yours by faith. It's not that you did it. He did it for you, and it is imputed to you. And then the passive obedience refers to Christ's passion during particularly, during which he accepted passively without resistance to God the suffering and the cross to which he was subjected for the satisfaction of sin. So those are the two parts. It's in our confession. This office, the Lord Jesus, that's mediator, did most willingly undertake, which that he might discharge, he was made under the law, did perfectly fulfill it, there's an act of obedience, and underwent the punishment due to us, there's the passive. So our own confession addresses that. He talks about 4 different righteousnesses. Did y'all read that and see those distinctions? The main thing he's wanting to do is talk about the righteousness by which we're justified. That righteousness which is imputed to us. So he's getting into the fact that as God, I was going to say the God-man, but first they talk about his divinity. He's righteous. And it's not that God gives us his very nature of righteousness, because only God is as God. I'm not saying we don't receive a righteous nature and we're not perfected, but we're not God. But Jesus has that righteousness. He, as a man, has perfect righteousness. And then, even though he was a perfect man and just as a man, apart from him being sent by the Father and a mediator, and apart from him actually fulfilling the terms of his ministry, he's still righteous. But what he's got to do is obey what we call the covenant of redemption. He has to obey things like be baptized. He has to be tempted in all ways that we are, yet without sin, in order that he might be perfected and made complete. So part of his task as mediator was to be to obey the covenant of redemption, that he might receive a reward, which is our salvation. More than that, but as it pertains to us, that. But then he's saying here, the Godhead gives it virtue. So that righteousness which is imputed to us is given its virtue, its power, its weight, its glory by the virtue of the God-man being God. And then the righteousness of his manhood makes it capable for him to obey the law, that obedience might be to our justification. And then him in the two natures having the righteousness as the mediator allows him to have the authority to do that righteousness, to do the work for which he was ordained. So, continued Greatheart, here then is a righteousness that Christ as God has no need of, for he is God without it. Here is righteousness that Christ as man has no need of to make himself so. So, for he is a perfect man without it. He's just trying to talk about this. I haven't read this before. I haven't read this kind of distinctions so in four manners like this. I've thought about the divinity of Christ, and I've thought about the righteousness of Christ, and I've thought about the act of obedience of Christ being imputed to us, but I haven't thought about it in four categories in these directions before. But I'm just trying to explain to you what Bunyan's teaching. And the main thing I want you to get out of it is the fact that the work of Christ on your behalf involves not only suffering for your sin, though that is necessary, but also actively obeying the law of God for you. Both are necessary. That's a key Reformed doctrine that Catholics don't believe. That's why they got penance and they suffer for themselves, and that's why they got sacraments and they obey for themselves, along with the help that they believe they get from Christ. But we're Reformed. We go to the Bible. Now, where in the Bible does it say Christ obeyed the law for us? What was that? 2 Corinthians 5? Yeah, that's a good text. Let's go to that one. That one's, we'll go there. 5:21. For he, that's God the Father, made him, Jesus Christ, who knew no sin, there's his nature, to be sin for us, that's imputation, that we might become the righteousness of God in him. And that's imputation, which leads to sanctification and glory. So there it's saying he was imputed with our sin, which is really getting into his passive obedience. Romans 5:19. Yes, sir.
He says, for as through the one man's disobedience many were made sinners, even so the obedience of the one, the many will be made righteous.
Amen. It's very clear. So we saw in 5:21 this imputation of sin to Christ, and we know that having had sin imputed to him, it was for the purpose of him being punished for that sin. Have y'all ever thought about the fact that Jesus was punished? It was a penal satisfaction. He wasn't merely a symbolic sacrifice that was suffering at the hands of evil men, demonstrating the love of God to the world by suffering so nobly in the sight of people. No, that's what's happening visibly. But invisibly, he's suffering the just wrath of God upon his person as the God-man, the mediator. And I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but that's because our sin was imputed to him. That means credited to him, laid upon him. And then God declared him the opposite of justified, guilty, and punished him. That's why he was separated or forsaken. And then the act of obedience here, it's really clear as by one man's obedience. If you look at Matthew 5, he just says he came to fulfill here, but he had to obey. It says, I did not come in 5:17, do not think that I came to destroy the law or the prophets. I did not come to destroy, but to fulfill. For assuredly, I say to you, till heaven and earth pass away, one jot or one tittle will by no means pass from the law till all is fulfilled. So he came to fulfill the law, obey it. Go to Galatians. Here it says in Galatians 4:4, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law. So he was born under the law and was subject to its demands in a meritorious way. We could go to other texts, like Hebrews does talk too, but I just wanted you to see that he came to obey in place of his people. And it's not merely he came to suffer. Like a good question would be this. What is the gospel, ma'am? What is the gospel, sir? Christ died for sinners. Okay, that's right. You're good. That's good. Have you ever thought about this? Why did God not send Christ as a man to just suffer immediately? Why be born and live all that time? It says right there in Galatians 4, he had to be born under the law, born of a woman. And it's not merely out of sovereignty of God that he chose it to be that way, but we needed an obedience that we haven't fulfilled. We need a righteousness that we haven't obeyed. It had more than a purpose of demonstrating the sovereignty of God and his wisdom in redemption. It has a theological purpose that satisfies the judgment of God. We're not going to be justified if we don't have an obedience to Christ, to the law of God.
Is that John 16 when it says that the Holy Spirit will convict the world of righteousness because I go to my Father?
Oh, yeah, interpreting that. Off the top of my head, I'd have to go back there and look at that. But yeah, I think that it's very plain that God resurrected him. He resurrected himself, but God resurrected him, declaring to be the Son of God with power, and he received the Spirit. And in essence, it's the evidence that everything he did in his humiliated state was perfect and pleasing unto the Father. The resurrection is like, he's righteous, right? And so when he's saying, convince the world of righteousness, I think what he is saying is, because I go to the Father, it's like, He's been elevated. The humble shall be given, shall be raised or lifted. And I think that's what he's saying is the Holy Spirit is going to convince and shame unbelieving world for its righteousness or lack thereof by contrast to mine.
Yeah, because I was thinking, you want to go to heaven, you have to merit it. And Christ merited, that's why he ascended.
Yeah.
I guess it would be like you see the righteousness of Christ, he's ascended. And that will convict you.
Mm-hmm. So let me go to the next one. Just remember that active and passive. It's a little deceptive. He is active when he's suffering. Because the will of God in his suffering was that he not resist. And to trust God and be tempted in the midst of this unfathomable trial of temptation, he is actively engaged in obedience and in love. He is willingly offering himself up in the face of penal wrath. So when we say passive, it's not like he's just let go. He's actively offering himself up. So that active and passive can get a little misleading if you think about it that way. Don't think about it that way. Just think about what God's law needs to have satisfied. God's law needs to be satisfied in that justice must be served for your sin, right? And God's law must be satisfied in that you will not be declared righteous unless you have a perfect righteousness credited to you. And Christ fulfills both of those parts. And we see that combined as the obedience of Christ for us. What did belief in that deed done by the Savior do to that good man Christian? His burden fell off. When it came to a greater understanding, his burden fell off, and God, it said in there, he was permitted to have the burden until he saw that. What did the thought do to his wife, Christiana? She said, affection.
We were wondering about when Christian was converted, and we're saying, okay, when his burden fell off.
Yeah.
And now when Christiana comes to that very place, she says that she had found joy prior to that, and it already says that she had been converted. That's how Great Heart speaks of it. He says, because his Great Heart says to her, like, this salvation has come to you and your sons and mercy. I think he says that prior to coming to that place.
To the deed done for pardon?
Yeah.
But do you think that he's referencing the gate or the city of destruction?
I think the gate was where he was
Okay,
saying.
yeah, I do too. And I can't remember. I remember us stating that it's one of two ways back in part 1, and then coming across that interpretation that he didn't understand more as fully the blessings of salvation until they came to the cross. So even though he has this awareness of his sin, he's actually already been forgiven of it. And I can't remember where I ended up wounding up when we did that. I remember stating the two, kind of waffling. But the way I look at it now is that he was converted at the gate, and she was, and that they're just coming into a greater experience of the salvation that is theirs through understanding the deed done for their pardon. Meditation upon Christ, person and his and work. What does that do for you? So, no need to answer there, but I want to encourage you, brothers and sisters, to take time to do that. Meditate. Be intentional with that. There's so many things that you can meditate on, and they're not bad. They're good. But if they drowned out the glory of God seen in the person and work of Christ, return again and meditate upon the person and work of Christ. Go to a text and just begin thinking about it, praying about it. Um, 10 minutes till. He talks about simple sloth and presumption and how they were turned, how others who followed them were turned out of the way. He says, what arguments did these evil ones, by what arguments did these three evil ones prevail? So if you turn to page 288, They persuaded several to go out of the way. That means to depart from Christ. Any attachment that these people claim to have towards Christ and any following of him, they persuaded to be turned away from that. And how did they do it? First of all, they brought up a bad report of the Lord, that he was a taskmaster. Have y'all ever heard that? Somebody say, God's ways are burdensome. Strong is it? This commandment to obey God and to aim for perfection is too much. God's a taskmaster. Have y'all ever heard that? Yeah, you hear it in different ways. Think about the ways it comes out. I don't like the way that text focuses on obedience. That's saying God's a taskmaster in essence. Because if you're saying that that's not, if it is coming from the text, and you're saying when someone's teaching or preaching obedience to Christ by faith in the power of the Spirit, but if you're handling the text and focusing on that, because the text is focusing on that, and somebody says there's too much call to obedience with that preaching or that teaching, that's a form of saying God is a taskmaster. You might be thinking you're impugning a person, but that person, if they are preaching from the Bible, you cannot separate impugning a person who represents God from impugning God himself. And you're essentially saying God's a harsh taskmaster. That's not my God. Well, that's the God of the Bible. He calls us to faithful obedience. Not perfection, but what's the other action we say? Direction. Yeah, not perfection, but direction. We're always abounding more and more. We never arrived. And obedience to his commandments isn't a burden because he first loved us and now we love him. So they also said, they also brought up an evil report of the good land, saying it wasn't half as good as some pretended it to be. How are ways that people can do that today? Professing or not, where they say that heaven and the glories to come aren't half as good as what the Bible says that they are. How can that happen? Ben.
Well, first and foremost, through ignorance.
Yeah,
They
ignorance.
just simply don't understand what God has prepared for those who love him. And maybe they pick up on what the world or what the culture has brought up about what heaven is like, clouds, harps, babies, or flying around, as opposed to God himself being there, the people of God, the glory of God, and the new earth, new heavens, and so forth.
Yeah, amen. Another way, too, is more indirectly, but it's setting up other things in opposition to that. There are other things that you ought to pursue in this life. There are other idols that are far more greater in value. And people might not preach that directly to your face, but they live it, and they speak of it, and their affections are apparent, and there's an expectation with those affections that you share in those. And in essence, what they're saying is what you're hoping for isn't worth it. And I'm not trying to impugn sin to somebody or impute sin to somebody when I know it's not consciously intentional that that's what they're saying, like sloth is represented here. But that's a way that it can come across. And the world does that in many means. It's not going to be telling you, the world is not going to be telling you, trust the Lord. Wait patiently for him. The glories to come far, far outweigh all the sufferings of this world. Be faithful, believer. The world will not say that to you. It will only say, this is more important. This is what life's living for. This is what you should do. And what that's telling you is it's not worth waiting for. Glory's not worth. So that's a way that can practically be seen. And the people who linger after lust, have no heart for the things of God, dull, are led astray by them. Spiritually dull. I'm going to skip 4. What is giant grim an emblem of? So what would you say giant grim is? That was a tough one, I think. I think I have it pulled up here, but maybe I overwrote it with, yeah, here we go. I'll just read a commentary from an old Pilgrim's Progress book where somebody gave a commentary on it. It's not very easy to determine the precise idea of the author in each of the giants who assault the pilgrims and are slain by the conductor and his assistants. Some have supposed that unbelief is here meant. Some have supposed, wrongly, this guy's about to say, that the giant grim represents an internal foe, unbelief. But grim or bloody man seem not to be opposite names for an inward foe, nor can it be conceived that unbelief should more violently assault those who are under the care of a valiant conductor. So they're talking about Greatheart. How come unbelief is your foe when Greatheart's the one leading you through, right? I apprehend, therefore, that this giant was intended for the emblem of certain active men who busied themselves in framing and executing persecuting statutes, which was done at the time when this was written, more violently than it had been before. So what is this representative of? According to this commentator who knows some of the history, he says, just like the lions, church and state, this grim is an even greater manifestation, particularly of servants of the devil and of this world, who execute persecuting statutes and framing Christians in opposition as they approach the local visible church. He goes on, he says, thus the temptation to fear man, which at all times assaults the believer when required to make an open profession of his faith, was exceedingly increased. And as heavy fines and severe penalties in an accession to reproach and contempt deterred men from joining themselves in communion with dissenting churches, that way was almost unoccupied. And the travelers went through bypaths, according to the author's sentiments on the subject. But the preaching of the gospel, by which the ministers of Christ wielded the sword of the Spirit, overcame this enemy. For the example and exhortations of such courageous combatants animated even weak believers to overcome their fears and to act according to their consciences, leaving the event to God. This seems to have been the author's meaning, and perhaps he also intended to encourage his brethren boldly to persevere in resisting such persecuting statutes, confidently expecting that they should prevail for the repeal of them, by which, as by the death of the giant, the pilgrims might be freed from additional terror in acting consistently with their avowed principles. So, do we face persecuting statutes presently when we want to approach a holy church and a biblical church in our country? Not right now. I'm not saying that there's not forms of persecution, but it's not overtly legal yet. But if somehow true Christianity gets labeled by our civil government as in some way detrimental to society, some way undermining in their perversion of error. Men will make laws to oppose you for being consistent with what the Bible says and worshiping and congregating with God's people and serving Him. And we need to be ready for the fear of man. How do you get ready? How do you remain watchful and prepared in fighting the sin of the fear of man?
Brother, didn't they just try and do that with COVID-19? And didn't they successfully do that in Canada, where they persecuted the churches there and shut them down
Yeah.
more thoroughly than they were able to do down here in America?
Yeah. Brother Tom, I don't think they heard the first part. He was talking about COVID in Canada and how that was done and with COVID. Amen. Yeah, I saw that. We saw that plainly. They were wanting to make a commandment for even here in Seminole County.
To be preaching the gospel now.
Amen.
It's like the little boys who wanted to lead when there was nothing to fear, and then how great, when fear came, they went behind and great heart had to take lead.
Yeah.
If you're not preaching the gospel now, you're not going to do it when trouble comes.
You remember, brothers and sisters, Jesus' call to take up your cross and follow Him, deny yourself. If you love this world and you do not confess Him, He will not confess you. Those are warnings to keep us on the narrow path, trusting Him and not fearing man. Remember John 12, and I'll stop here. But in John 12, there were many who believed in Him, but they wouldn't confess Him. It says, verse 42, nevertheless, even among the rulers, many believed in Him, which is a counterfeit faith. But because of the Pharisees, they did not confess Him, lest they should be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the praise of men more than the praise of God. Are you ready? I'm not saying be naive and ignorantly zealous and go provoke things. But I'm saying be bold and zealous in humility with knowledge. And stand for righteousness. Preach the gospel to your neighbor. Don't be afraid in your community to preach the gospel to people. It's that battle with sin that you face, the fear of man now, it will come a time when you will face perhaps greater forms of temptation. And he who is faithful in a little is faithful in much. And be ready to die. Think about your death. Am I ready to die, and do I see it as a sleep? Am I ready to go to heaven? Because if you're entertaining a guilty conscience and have these hidden sins, and then your assurance is undermined by your sin, it contributes and adds to the temptation of your cowardice. But someone who's dependent upon God and living by faith and putting to death sin, their hope is in Him. They are walking with Him. So they're able to stand up for the truth in the time of temptation. And it may come where we have to actually be put in prison or lose our jobs. And we can see it in Canada. And I saw a brother there, and he was, I don't know, he was telling people to get out, and the police didn't want to get out of his place, but they had no right to be there, and they still didn't want to get out. And that's people who weren't like they were in Pilgrim's, John Bunyan's day. In John Bunyan's day, they knew they were opposing people who wanted to go to these dissenting churches, and they were doing it on theological false grounds. Up in Canada, they're doing it more under this guise of help. But that's the nature of man, is they suppress the truth and unrighteousness, and all they're doing is looking for an occasion to resist God. And when His people stand up and are living a holy life, and they have means legally to do that, people are going to, in their pride, do that. So you got to be ready. And I'm not saying it in arrogance, self-dependence, self-will, but in humility, meekness, dependence upon Christ, who overcame the world, who is with you. So let's pray. Father in heaven, we praise you. Help us, Lord, to, by faith, with the weapons of your warfare, which are mighty for bringing down strongholds, wage war against our own flesh. I pray that you would help us to overcome our fear of man and sin that hinders us from being a light unto this world. Lord, help us to grow bold and in humility, that our boldness be rightly informed and a manifestation of your glory, because our boldness is built on Christ and your word. And I pray that in our times, Lord, that should you, by your will, cause us, put us into a time of suffering, that you would help us now to be putting death to sin and be prepared and deliver us by carrying us through it, that we might glorify your name. Amen.